What can we anticipate from the Federal Reserve's decision today? What the Federal Reserve decides to do with interest rates on Wednesday won't be all that mysterious. How the central bank moves forward from here is where the intrigue arises. The likelihood that the Federal Open Market Committee, which sets interest rates, would approve a quarter percentage point increase at the conclusion of the two-day meeting is nearly 100%, according to the markets. The Fed's benchmark borrowing rate will then have increased 10 times since March 2022, bringing it to its desired range of 5% to 5.25%. What happens next will be difficult for investors to predict. Will the Fed signal that it is through raising rates, or will it leave open the possibility of tightening even further if it determines that more needs to be done to combat inflation? According to Colin Martin, fixed income analyst at Charles Schwab, what's most important is how they convey the potential for a pause going forward. How do they manage to do that while presumably leaving the door slightly ajar? That will involve striking a balance between indicating that a pause is likely but stressing that any future increases in inflation will depend on new data. As Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and his colleagues discuss the future of monetary policy, a number of factors will be in play. The primary concern of government officials has been inflation. Recent data suggests a softening, but only to a point that is still far higher than the Fed's 2% target. For personal consumption expenditures, the Dallas Fed, for example, creates a gauge known as the trimmed mean that effectively discards extreme readings. According to it, annual inflation in March was roughly 4.7%, slightly changed from August 2022, and up from a pace of 3.9% in March 2022. In March, the Consumer Price Index was at 5%, down from 8.5% the previous month. For Fed officials, none of those numbers are adequate. Inflation is still much too high and so my job is not done, Fed Governor Christopher Waller stated in a speech on April 14 regardless of the measure. I read these data as showing that we haven't made much progress toward our inflation target, which puts me roughly where I was regarding the outlook for the economy at the last FOMC meeting and on the same course for monetary policy. Considering the bank's problems. The nettlesome financial issues that claimed another bank earlier this week when J.P. Morgan Chase absorbed First Republic, which had been the country's 14th largest bank by assets, have, however, drawn the majority of the market's attention. The economy comes next. With the first quarter's gross domestic product expanding at just 1.1% annualized and the job market showing symptoms of weakness, an impending recession appears to be drawing nearer. According to Goldman Sachs, the Fed will telegraph a change in policy this week as a result of all these crosscurrents. The firm's economists anticipate that the FOMC will adjust the post-meeting statement's phrasing to indicate an impending shift. The emphasis will be on changes to the statement's future guidance, according to economist David Maracle of Goldman. Because bank stress is likely to result in a tightening of credit, we anticipate the committee to indicate that it anticipates pausing in June but maintains a hawkish bias, stopping earlier than it initially anticipated. A hawkish bias describes the tendency of Fed policymakers to emphasize the necessity for interest rates to remain low even when it appears that no further increases are imminent. While acknowledging other pressures and the ability to now just let the previous hikes run their course through the economy, the goal would be to maintain the central bank's reputation for fighting inflation. Maracle anticipates a statement that might read something like, the committee anticipates that the stance of monetary policy will most likely be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time but will closely monitor incoming information and assess the implications for monetary policy. Maracle expects to see this sentence in the section of the statement where the Fed provides guidance. Enduring inflation. Although the market is betting on a dovish Fed that will be inclined to stop raising rates and start cutting them later this year, persistently high prices could change that. As evidenced by the Atlanta Fed's sticky price CPI, which contrasts prices for products and services that don't fluctuate much over time against those that do, inflation has turned out to be more enduring than authorities had anticipated. Sticky prices gained 6.6% annually in March and have been rising generally, whereas flexible price CPI only increased 1.6% and has sharply fallen since peaking at 19.7% in March 2022. Housing costs are sticky. At the absolute least, those types of data will put the Fed on high alert to prevent it from lowering its guard too soon. In a letter, Citigroup economist Andrew Hollenhorst observed that the majority of Fed officials don't seem comfortable that the rate hike cycle is over. The consumer price data for April is due on May 10, 1 week before the next Fed policy meeting, which will take place on June 13 to 14. The probable need for additional rate hikes is kept on the table by the committee's middle, which understands the macroeconomic impact of credit tightening that is still uncertain, according to Hollenhorst. Furthermore, the most recent data are not encouraging in terms of bringing inflation under control. In fact, Citi predicts that before the Fed eventually starts to pause, there will be additional hikes in June and July in addition to the one at this week's meeting. Hollenhorst noted that the main focus of the statement and Chair Powell's press conference should be to reiterate that the policy path will be data-dependent, rather than guiding to any preordained policy path. The Fed officials, who often act in tandem, may differ in opinion, which could complicate the delicate balancing act of how to announce the rate hike. Since the beginning of March, comments have reflected opposing viewpoints between those who anticipate a change in policy and those who continue to prioritize inflation. Quincy Crosby, head of global strategy at LPL Financial, questioned whether this would be the final meeting of the Fed. The Federal Reserve is divided. It's open to the public. You can only speculate on the nature of the internal discussion. This Fed meeting is really important.